The monitoring station hung in the darkness like a silent watcher, its metal hull reflecting the distant stars that surrounded it. On all sides of Sullivan sat at her console in the observation deck, her long fingers dancing across the holographic displays that floated before her. Violet Eyes, the Karathi, had always been a careful people, methodical in their study of the cosmos, and tonight was supposed to be just another routine shift scanning the empty sectors. Near the galactic rim, she yawned and stretched her forearms, each movement graceful, despite the boredom that had settled into her bones after 6 hours of watching absolutely nothing happen in the void. Tea beside her console had gone cold an hour ago, but she sipped it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste as her eyes tracked the usual patterns of cosmic radiation and distant stellar phenomena. Then the console chirped. It was a small sound, almost insignificant. But Sullivan's heart began to beat faster as she leaned forward to examine the new reading that had appeared on her primary display. The signature made no sense at first glance. She saw energy outputs that defied every principle of modern reactor design, mixed somehow with technology that looked primitive by current standards. As if someone had strapped a fusion torch to an ancient chemical rocket, her training kicked in immediately, and she began running diagnostics, certain that her equipment had finally decided to malfunction after months of flawless operation. But
diagnostics
came back clean. Every sensor, every calibration metric, every redundant system confirmed the same impossible truth. There was something out there, and it matched no known vessel in any database. Lavinous breath caught in her throat as she cross-referenced the signature against the historical archives, diving deeper into records that dated back centuries. When the match appeared on her screen, her entire body went rigid with shock. Human reactor signature probability. Match. 97%. The words glowed on her display like accusations, like warnings, like the punchline to a joke that the universe had been setting up for 800 years. No. She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet observation deck. That's not possible. Humans were legends. Stories that parents told their children to make them behave. Cautionary tales about a warrior race that had swept through 12 sectors, like a wildfire through dry grass before vanishing without explanation. Had always loved those stories as a child. Had spent countless nights reading every fragment of data she could find about the mysterious species that had disappeared during the Great Silence. But they were just stories. They had to be her supervisor. Karnak would laugh at her if she reported this, would tell her to recalibrate her sensors and stop reading adventure novels during her shift. She should ignore it, should mark it as a data anomaly, and move on with her night instead. Her fingers moved across the console with a will of their own, composing a standard hailing message in ancient Karathi trade lingua, the kind of greeting that hadn't been used in active communication for at least 3 centuries. She hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the transmission key, before finally pressing it and sending the message out into the void. Seconds crawled by like Arcelavan watched her chronometer, counting each heartbeat, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. Then her console erupted with incoming signals, and she nearly fell out of her chair in shock. The voice crackled through the speakers, speaking in trade lingua with perfect grammar, but with an accent that sounded strange and ancient to her. Ears Karathi, monitoring station. This is the TRSC Perseverance of the Terran Republic Survey Corps, the voice said calmly, as if this were the most normal conversation in the galaxy. We apologize for any alarm our approach may have caused, and request permission to transmit our identification codes. Sullivan's hand shook as she reached for the emergency alert, her fingers fumbling across controls she had only used in drill klaxons. Began to wail throughout the station as blast doors slammed shut and automated defense systems powered up with the whine of charging capacitors. She could hear shouting in the corridors outside, could hear her colleagues scrambling to their emergency positions as the entire facility went into immediate lockdown within minutes. Karnak burst into the observation deck, his usually calm face twisted with panic and confusion. What happened? He demanded, his 4 eyes scanning the displays frantically. What triggered the alert? Sullivan couldn't speak, could only point at her console where the human vessel's signature pulsed like a warning beacon. Karnak stared at the screen for a long moment. His breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Get high command on secure channels immediately, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just realized that the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. Tell them we need the classified data cores from the restricted archives and tell them why 2 hours later. Sullivan sat in the same chair, now surrounded by senior officers who spoke in hushed tones while they reviewed her sensor logs. Karnak returned carrying a small container made of black metal, its surface covered in warning symbols that made her skin crawl. He placed it on the console with trembling hands and entered a code that was longer than any Sullivan had ever seen. The container opened with a hiss of escaping gas, and inside lay a data core that looked older than the station itself. Was hoping I would never have to open this, Karnak said as he connected the core to the main computer. I was hoping it would stay locked away forever. Just another piece of paranoid history from a more fearful age. The data that flowed across the screens made Sullivan's blood-run cold battle reports from 8 centuries ago, each one more horrifying than the last footage of human ships tearing through Confederation fleets with casual brutality records of the siege of Katanas, where 5,000 humans held off an army of 2 million for 3 months. Documentation of the surrender armada, where 12 species had simultaneously capitulated rather than face human retaliation, and weapons analysis that showed technology that shouldn't have been possible then and was barely understood. Now if they're real, Karnak whispered, his eyes fixed on footage of a human soldier continuing to fight after losing an arm, showing no signs of shock or pain until the battle was over. Then, so was everything else. All of it was true on Sullivan's console. A new message appeared from the human ship. It was polite, almost friendly, requesting docking permission at Bay 7 and offering to transmit full crew manifests and mission profiles. She looked up at Karnak, saw the fear in his eyes, and understood that they were standing at a moment that would reshape the galaxy. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The humans had returned, and the legends would have to be rewritten. Show reached for the communications panel with a steady hand, though her heart's hammered in her chest like drums. TRSC Perseverance, she said carefully. This is monitoring station Kareth 7, docking permission granted to Bay 7. Please proceed at standard approach velocity. The response came quickly, the human voice warm and grateful. Thank you. Kareth 7, we're eager to meet you. It's been a very long journey. Sullivan closed her eyes and wondered what kind of monsters or heroes were about to walk through their airlock. I suppose she was about to find out. The diplomatic bay had never been prepared so quickly or with such barely concealed. Panicked Sullivan watched as maintenance crews rushed to make the aging facility presentable, their movements jerky with fear as they placed translation devices in refreshment stations that might be completely useless for a species nobody truly understood. Station Commander Vareth stood beside her, his formal robes hastily donned and slightly crooked, his ceremonial weapon belt buckled incorrectly in his haste. Remember, he said quietly to Sullivan, we observe protocol no matter what walks through that airlock. If the legends are true, our survival may depend on appearing civilized and unthreatening. The airlock hissed and began its cycling sequence. Sullivan felt her primary heart skip a beat as pressure equalized, and the inner door slid open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. In the sudden silence, the humans who emerged were a surprisingly ordinary Commander Rachel. Chen stepped through first, her brown eyes taking in the assembled Karathi delegation with obvious curiosity rather than hostility. She was smaller than Sullivan had expected from the legends, standing barely taller than a Karatha youth, her frame appearing almost fragile compared to the warriors of Nightmare that were supposed to have conquered half the galaxy behind her. Came from more crew members, each one looking tired and confused rather than threatening. They wore uniforms that were clean but clearly well used, carrying equipment cases that bore the scuffs and scratches of long service. Thank you for allowing us to dock, Commander Chen said in flawless trade lingua, though her accent made some of the vowels sound strange to Sullivan's ears. I'm Commander Rachel Chen of the Terran Republic Survey Corps, and this is my crew. We've been in cryosleep for what our chronometers say is 30 years. Following several failed colony establishment attempts in the outer reaches, Vareth bowed in the formal Karathi greeting. His forearms spread wide in a gesture of peaceful welcome. Commander Chen. I am Station Commander Vareth, and this is Officer Sullivan, who first detected your vessel. We are honored by your presence. Though I must confess that your arrival has caused considerable concern among our government. Chen's eyebrows drew together in confusion. Concern? I don't understand why a Republic survey ship would cause alarm. Has there been some incident with other human vessels in this region? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sullivan saw Vareth struggle with how to respond finally. He gestured toward the conference room they had prepared. Perhaps we should discuss this matter somewhere more comfortable. What we must tell you is both lengthy and troubling. An hour later, Chen sat at the conference table with her hands gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles had turned. Images flickered, showing scenes of destruction that were 800 years old, but still horrifying in their detail. This isn't possible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Republic was committed to peaceful exploration and cultural exchange. We would never engage in aggressive conquest. Sullivan, who had been assigned to present the historical data, manipulated the controls to bring up a new set of records. Commander Chen, according to our archives, the vessels that attacked Confederation space did not appear until approximately 40 years after the last Republic survey ships were detected. The timeline suggests that something changed on Earth after your mission departed. Chen's engineer, a man named Marcus Webb, leaned forward to examine the ship designations more closely. Those aren't Republic hull numbers, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. And those flags, those insignias, I've never seen anything like them. Chen stood abruptly and began pacing the length of the conference room. Show me everything. She demanded. Every battle record, every communication intercept, every piece of data you have about these ships and what they did for the next 3 hours. The human crew watched in growing horror as Sullivan walked them through 8 centuries of archived nightmares. The formation of something called the Unification on Earth, a totalitarian government that rose from the chaos following environmental collapse and resource wars, the construction of the war fleets that swept outward. From Sol system like a plague, the brutal efficiency of human military tactics that treated casualties as acceptable mathematics rather than lives lost, the genetic engineering, programs designed to create superior soldiers, and, finally, the mysterious disappearance when the Confederation's predecessor government had deployed some kind of containment weapon that sealed the Sol system behind an impassable barrier of collapsed space. Chen watched it all with the expression of someone attending a funeral for everything she had once believed in. When the presentation ended, she turned to face Vareth with tears streaming down her face. We left Earth to build something better, she said, her voice breaking. We wanted to find new worlds where humanity could grow beyond its violent past. Instead, the people we left behind became exactly what we were trying to escape. Webb put a hand on her shoulder but said nothing because there was nothing to say. The conference room fell into uncomfortable silence until Vareth's communication device chirped with an incoming priority message. He listened for a moment, his face going pale, before looking up at the assembled group. Long-range sensors have detected 3 more vessels entering the system, he said quietly. They match human design parameters, but they're much more advanced than Commander Chen's ship. They bear markings that match the unification designations from the historical records. Chen's head snapped up, her grief instantly transforming into sharp focus. Show me their approach vector and tactical disposition, she ordered. Then seemed to realize she had no authority here. Please, she added, if they're unification vessels, you need to understand what you're dealing with. The tactical display that appeared showed 3 sleek warships moving in perfect formation, their hulls bristling with weapon systems that made even Varatha's military experience seem inadequate. They ignored all hailing frequencies from the station, deploying automated reconnaissance drones that began scanning everything within range. Then a broadcast came through on all channels simultaneously, the voice cold and mechanical. Despite its human origin, this is the UN's manifest destiny to all vessels in this system. You are operating in Terran space without authorization. Submit identification codes and prepare for inspection, or face immediate consequences. Vareth looked at Chen with desperate hope, Commander. You said your ship is less advanced than theirs? Does that mean there's nothing we can do? Chen's expression hardened into something fierce and determined. It means they've had 800 years to perfect the art of killing, she said. Bluntly, but it also means they've forgotten something important. They've forgotten that humans weren't always conquerors once upon a time. We were explorers who believed that the galaxy was big enough for everyone. She turned to Sullivan with sudden intensity. You said you've been researching human history since you were young. How much do you know about the Republic's final expeditions before we left? Sullivan's mind raced through everything she had ever read. There were rumors of failsafes, she said slowly. Reaching back for half-remembered fragments from obscure texts, contingency plans in case Earth ever became a threat to the colonies. But the records were fragmentary, and most researchers dismissed them as myths. Chen smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression. They weren't myths. She said the Republic knew exactly what humanity was capable of, and we made preparations, hidden facilities, secure data repositories, and yes, weapons we hoped would never be needed. She pulled a data chip from inside her uniform and placed it on the table before we entered cryosleep. I was given coordinates, locations that were supposed to be opened only if something had gone terribly wrong back home. I think it's time we found out what our ancestors left behind outside. The 3 unification warships continued their relentless approach and across the galaxy. Other species began receiving the news that would change everything. Humanity had returned, and this time, they brought nightmares that were all too real. The emergency session of the Galactic Confederation had been called within hours of the first confirmed human contact, and the great assembly hall on Capital Prime now filled with representatives from 47 different species. Sullivan watched the proceedings through a live feed from the monitoring station, fascinated and horrified in equal measure as centuries of carefully maintained peace began to crack under the weight of returning. Nightmare's ambassador Threll of the Velkari stood at the central podium, his tentacles writhing with agitation as he addressed the assembled delegates. We must consider immediate military action, he declared, his translated voice booming through the hall. 800 years ago, our predecessors made the mistake of hesitating, and that hesitation cost billions of lives across 12 sectors. We cannot afford to repeat their errors. From the opposite side of the chamber, Ambassador Kintha of the Herosians rose to respond, her crystalline body refracting the chamber lights into rainbow patterns. And what would you have us do, Threll? She asked. Coldly attack peaceful explorers who have done nothing to threaten us. The Republic crew has cooperated fully with all inquiries, and has even offered to help us understand the threat posed by their wayward cousins. The debate raged for hours, splitting the Confederation down philosophical and practical lines. Some species remembered the human wars too well to consider anything except immediate violence, argued for diplomacy, for understanding, for the possibility that not all humans were the monsters of legend. Meanwhile, at the edges of Confederation space, panic spread like wildfire. 3 border systems began evacuating civilian populations to core world's defense. Fleets mobilized to defensive positions they had not occupied in centuries and on 1,000 worlds. People looked up at the stars and wondered if the old nightmares were about to return back on the monitoring station. Sullivan had abandoned sleep entirely and now worked around the clock, diving deeper into the restricted archives. Chen had given her access to the Republic data cores, and what she found there painted a picture that was somehow worse than the legends suggested. The truth about humanity's disappearance had been deliberately suppressed according to the classified records. The Confederation's predecessor government had detected the unifications, military buildup, and realized they were facing an existential threat rather than risk open warfare with an enemy that had proven itself terrifyingly effective. They had deployed an experimental weapon that collapsed the stellar nursery surrounding Sol system. The weapon had created a bubble of unstable space-time 50 light-years across, filled with gravity wells and radiation storms that made navigation impossible. Was meant to be a permanent prison, a tomb for a species too dangerous to be allowed to spread. But the weapon had taken 3 years to deploy, and in that time, some human ships had escaped beyond the containment zone. The unification had survived, had rebuilt, and had apparently spent the last 8 centuries planning there. Returned Sullivan stared at the data for a long time before composing a report that she knew would shake the foundations of Confederation government. Shay had just finished encrypting the file when alarms began. Screaming throughout the station, the 3 unification ships had stopped ignoring hails and had instead sent a fleet-wide broadcast that was being picked up by every receiver and known space citizens of the former Confederation territories. A voice announced, with chilling, calm humanity, has returned to reclaim what was stolen from us. For 800 years, you imprisoned our species behind an artificial barrier, condemned billions to slow death through isolation. Now the barrier has failed, and we have come to collect the debt you owe. Stand down your military forces and prepare for integration into the new Terran hegemony, or face the consequences of continued resistance. The message repeated in 40 different languages, each translation perfect, each delivery utterly without compromise. Within an hour, 17 Confederation patrol vessels moved to intercept the unification ships in what was later recorded as the Battle of Riftgate. Station Sullivan watched the engagement through military feeds. Her hands clutched tight as she witnessed the future of the galaxy being written in fire and blood. The Confederation squadron deployed in textbook formation, a defensive sphere designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire while maintaining tactical flexibility. The unification ships didn't even slow down. What followed was not a battle but a demonstration of absolute superiority. Human vessels moved through space in ways that violated every principle of known physics, their drive somehow manipulating gravity itself to achieve instantaneous vector changes that would have turned any other crew into past the Confederation weapons fire, splashed harmlessly against shields that seemed to drink energy and grow stronger from hand. When the human ships returned fire, entire vessels simply ceased to exist, vaporized by weapons that released more energy than a small startha. Entire engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes and 13 seconds when it ended. All 17 Confederation vessels were gone, and the 3 unification ships continued on their original heading without a single scratch. On their hulls, the footage sent shockwaves through every government and known space. In the monitoring station's conference room, Commander Chen watched the battle replay with her jaw clenched, so tight that Sullivan could see muscles jumping in her neck. That shield technology, she said quietly. That's not possible with anything the Republic had developed. They've made breakthroughs that we can't even begin to understand. Her engineer Webb looked up from the tactical analysis he had been running. It's worse than that. Commander, look at their formation patterns. Their tactical responses, they're not just advanced. They're connected, some kind of neural network linking the ships into a single coordinated intelligence. Chen's eyes widened in horror. The Gestalt protocol. She breathed, oh God. They actually implemented it. Sullivan looked between them, not understanding. What is the Gestalt protocol? Chen rubbed her face with both hands. It was a theoretical proposal back when I was in academy training. She explained the idea was to link combat crews through neural implants, creating perfect coordination and shared tactical awareness. But the psychological risks were considered too severe. The test subjects lost their individual identities, became parts of a single hive mind. The Republic banned all research into it immediately. But the unification clearly had no such ethical concerns. Webb added bitterly, they've turned their soldiers into components of a war machine outside the conference room. The station bustled with activity as Confederation military advisors arrived to study the human threat, but Chen had already made her decision, and she stood to face Sullivan with grim determination. We need to reach that facility I mentioned, she said, the one at the coordinates from my data chip. If the unification is this advanced, conventional warfare won't stop them. We need the deterrent. Vareth entered at that moment, having just concluded a secure call with Confederation High Command Commander Chen. He said formally, High Command has authorized a mission to Earth space. They're providing a fast courier vessel with experimental stealth capabilities and a mixed crew of volunteers from multiple species. The Confederation is trusting you to find something that can stop your people before they burn the galaxy. Chen accepted this responsibility with a simple nod. We'll need full access to your navigational data on the dead zone, she said, and we'll need to move fast. Long-range intelligence suggests the main unification fleet is already mobilizing from Sol System if they launch in force. We'll have less than a week before they reach core Confederation space. Sullivan stepped forward before she could stop herself. I volunteer to go with you, she said, surprising herself with her own certainty. I've studied human history my entire life, and I understand your language and culture better than most of my people. You'll need a Karathi liaison, and I want to see Earth with my own eyes. Chen studied her for a long moment before extending her hand in the human gesture of agreement. Welcome aboard. Sullivan, she said, just understand that where we're going, we might not come back from. The dead zone earned its name for good reasons. They departed 6 hours later in a courier ship that bore no identification markings and carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon behind them. The Confederation prepared for war ahead of them lay, and whatever secrets the Republic had buried there and somewhere in the darkness. 200 unification warships began their journey toward the heart of galactic civilization, ready to remind the galaxy why humanity had once been the most feared species in known space. The courier ship Whisper cut through the dead zone like a needle through fabric, its experimental stealth systems bending sensor waves around its hull while its thin navigator plotted courses through gravitational chaos that would have destroyed any conventional vessel. Sullivan stood on the bridge beside Commander Chen, watching the viewscreen display dangers that made her want to retreat to safer space. The collapsed stellar nursery that surrounded Earth was a navigator's nightmare made real, filled with unstable gravity wells that shifted without warning and radiation storms that could cook a ship's crew in their own armor. I don't understand how your ancestors created this, she said quietly to Chen. The amount of energy required to destabilize an entire stellar region should be impossible. Chen's expression was grim as she studied the navigation plots. The weapon they used was called Ragnarok. She explained it was developed during Earth's final world war, back before we achieved any kind of unity. The theory was that you could use synchronized gravitational pulse generators to create a cascading collapse in stellar formation regions. The Republic discovered the weapon in an abandoned military research station and immediately realized what the Confederation had done to us. Their Valkyrie tactical officer, a being named Sorth, whose tentacles never stopped analyzing data streams, looked up from his console with what might have been concern. Commander, I'm detecting automated defense platforms ahead. He reported their old Republic design, but still active, and their weapons are charging. Chen moved to the communications station and entered a code sequence that she had memorized decades ago. This is Commander Rachel Chen. Republic Survey Corps' authorization code, Theta 7 Alpha Niner. She broadcast on encrypted Republic frequencies, requesting safe passage under Article 12 of the Colonial Defense Protocol. For a long moment, nothing happened, and wondered if they were about to be vaporized by weapons that were older than most civilizations then. The defense platforms powered down, and a mechanical voice responded in ancient English. Authorization confirmed. Commander Chen, welcome home. Be advised that Earth has undergone significant changes since your departure. Recommend extreme caution. They passed through the defense perimeter into the inner system, and what they saw made even Chen gasp. In shock, hung in space like a wounded soldier. Its surface, scarred by centuries of industrial militarization that had transformed the blue-green jewel of humanity's birth into something harsh and angular. Massive space elevators connected the surface to orbital rings that bristled with weapon emplacements. Shipyards the size of small moons floated in high orbit, their construction bays empty now, but clearly designed for mass production of war vessels. And everywhere, there were defense satellites forming layers of protection so dense that approaching the planet without authorization would be suicide. My God. Chen whispered, what did they do to her? Their Hosian medic Kyra, whose crystalline form refracted light in sad patterns, consulted her analysis of planetary biosigns. The population readings are much lower than historical records suggest. She reported, I'm detecting approximately 3 billion life signs, down from the 12 billion that should be present based on growth projections. Webb pulled up genetic scan data and his face went pale. Commander, You need to see this, he said urgently. The biosigns Kyra is detecting. They're not baseline human anymore. The genetic markers have been deliberately altered. This is systematic engineering on a species-wide scale. Chen moved to his station and studied the data with growing horror. They didn't just build weapons. She said slowly they rebuilt themselves. Unification used genetic engineering to create what they believed were superior humans, and they killed anyone who didn't meet their standards. The implications hung in the air like poison. 9 billion people, dead or sterilized, sacrificed on the altar of genetic purities. Elevin felt sick as she realized the full scope of what the unification represented. These weren't just conquerors seeking territory or resources. They were ideological extremists who believed in a vision of humanity so narrow that it excluded most of their own species. The coordinates, Chen said, forcing herself back to the mission. Take us to the coordinates from my data chip, Luna. The old moon, specific location in the Mare Imbrium region. The whisper descended toward Luna with all stealth systems at maximum, hoping to avoid detection by the automated systems that surely monitored every approach. The facility they found was hidden beneath 30 meters of lunar regolith, its entrance sealed by doors that still bore the Republic seal. Chen placed her hand on the biometric scanner and held her breath. Door recognized her genetic signature as Republic crew and opened with the groan of mechanisms that hadn't moved in 8 centuries inside. Emergency lighting flickered to life, revealing corridors lined with memory banks and equipment that had been waiting patiently for someone to activate it. The crew spread out, each member searching different sections of the facility with growing urgency. Sullivan found the main data repository in what had once been a command center, its quantum-locked storage systems still functional despite the passage of time. Commander, she called out, you need to see this. Chen arrived within moments, and together they began accessing the files that the Republic had left behind. What they found was damning evidence of crimes that would horrify any species. The Unification's rise to power had been built on genocide, on the systematic murder of billions deemed genetically inferior. Records showed forced sterilization programs, concentration camps where undesirables were worked to death, and medical experiments that made Sullivan want to vomit. But there was also something else: technical specifications for a weapon system that the Republic had developed as insurance against exactly this scenario. It's a virus, Webb said as he studied the data specifically engineered to target the genetic markers that the Unification engineered into their population. It's keyed to attack only the modified DNA sequences that they use to identify their pure humans. Chen stared at the specifications with an expression that mixed hope and revulsion. It would kill them all, she said quietly. Every Unification soldier, every crew member, everyone on Earth who carries those genetic modifications. We could stop the invasion with a single deployment. The crew gathered in the command center, each one understanding the terrible choice they faced. Sorth's tentacles curled tight with distress. Using such a weapon would be genocide. He said, how would we be any better than the Unification if we commit the same atrocity they inflicted on their own people? Kyra's crystalline form flickered with conflicting emotions. But if we don't use it, they'll kill billions more, she countered. The footage from Riftgate showed that conventional weapons are useless against them. How many lives is our moral purity worth? Sullivan looked at Chen and saw a woman being torn apart by impossible decisions. What would the Republic have wanted? She asked. Softly, Chen laughed bitterly. The Republic died 800 years ago, she said, but I know what they believed. They believed that the moment you sacrifice your principles to survive, you've already lost everything worth saving. She turned to face her crew with determination hardening her features. We're not using the virus, she declared. We didn't come here to commit genocide. Even against genocidal monsters, there has to be another way. Webb had been studying the tactical data that filled the facility's memory banks. There might be, he said suddenly. Look at this. Commander of the Republic kept detailed records of Unification, ship designs and tactical doctrines. They studied everything about how the Unification fights, how they think, how they coordinate this data. If we can get it to the Confederation military, it might give them the edge they need. Chen's eyes lit up with hope. Information warfare, she breathed. We don't need to destroy them physically. We need to destroy their tactical advantage by making them predictable. Sorth began downloading the tactical archives into portable storage. This is petabytes of data. He said combat analysis from hundreds of engagements, psychological profiles, logistical studies. If the Confederation can analyze this fast enough, they'll know how the unification will respond to any given situation. They worked frantically to copy everything. Knowing that their time was limited, then the facility's long-range sensors, which had been passive until now, suddenly screamed a warning unification ships. Their thin navigator called out multiple contacts. They've detected us somehow. 6 vessels inbound at maximum thrust. Estimated arrival, 20 minutes. Chen made the decision instantly: get everything we've copied to the Whisper. She ordered, we fight our way out if we have to. They raced back to the ship with precious data storage units, feeling the weight of the galaxy's hope in their arms behind them. The facility's automated systems began a self-destruct sequence that would erase any trace of what the Republic had left behind. The Whisper launched from Luna with unification ships closing fast, and what followed was a desperate chase through the dead zone. The courier ship's stealth systems helped, but the unification vessels were relentless, pursuing them through gravity wells and radiation storms with inhuman precision. In the cargo bay, something went wrong. The Whisper arrived at Kareth Prime with barely 3 hours to spare before the main unification fleet would enter the system, and those 3 hours became a frenzy of preparation that would determine whether civilization survived or burned. Commander Chen stood in the Confederation Military Command Center, surrounded by officers from a dozen species who looked at her with mixed expressions of hope and suspicion. She uploaded the data they had recovered from Luna directly into the tactical network and watched as Military A's began processing 800 years of human warfare doctrine. This is everything the Republic learned about how the unification fights. She explained to the assembled commanders, their tactical patterns follow historical Earth's military doctrine going back thousands of years. They're predictable because they believe their methods are already perfect. Admiral Crench of the Velkari studied the data streams with his main optical cluster. These patterns suggest they'll attempt a standard breakthrough maneuver. He said thoughtfully, they'll concentrate force on our weakest defensive position and attempt to shatter our formation with overwhelming firepower. Chen nodded. That's exactly what they'll do, because it's worked for them for 8 centuries. But now that you know what's coming, you can prepare for it. Webb stepped forward to present the technical breakthrough they had achieved. We've also discovered their coordination system. He announced the unification crews use neural implants to link into a combat gestalt weave, manufactured jamming devices that will disrupt that link. It won't destroy their ships, but it will force them to fight as individuals instead of as a single coordinated. Intelligent Sullivan watched as hope began to replace despair in the faces. Around them, the Confederation had gone from facing certain annihilation to having a fighting chance, and that change in morale was perhaps more valuable than any weapon outside the command center. The greatest fleet ever assembled in Confederation history waited in defensive formation, 800 ships from 47 species, many of whom had been enemies within living memory, now stood together against the human ancient warships. Pulled from mothballs, flew alongside cutting-edge carriers, mining vessels. Retrofitted with weapons, flew in formation with dedicated warships. It was desperate and makeshift and beautiful in its unity then.
The unification fleet arrived.
And the beauty turned to terror. 200 vessels dropped out of FTL at the system's edge. Their hulls dark and predatory. Their weapons already charging, they moved in perfect synchronization. Not as individual ships, but as one massive organism bent on destruction. The unification commander broadcast on all frequencies, his voice cold and mechanical. This is Fleet Commander Zhao of the Terran Hegemony First Fleet. He announced, you have assembled in defense of illegitimate territorial claims. Stand down immediately, and you will be integrated peacefully. Resist, and you will be removed. Admiral Crench responded with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. This is Admiral Crench of the Galactic Confederation Defense Force. He said, we will not surrender our freedom. We will not submit to tyranny. If you want this system, you'll have to take it from our cold, dead hands. There was a moment of silence, and then space exploded. With violence, the battle began exactly as Chen had predicted, with the Unification Fleet concentrating its forces for a breakthrough, attempt against what they perceived as the weakest section of the Confederation line. But that weakness was a trap, and when the human ships committed to their attack, they found themselves surrounded by layered defenses and crossfire zones that turned their strength into a liability. Ships died in their hundreds in the opening minutes, both sides trading terrible blows. Unification vessels were superior in every technical measure, but the Confederation forces fought with desperate creativity that no algorithm could predict. Then Webb activated the neural jammers and everything changed. Dawn 17 unification vessels. The Gestalt network suddenly collapsed as jamming signals disrupted the neural links that bound their crews together. Soldiers who had been components of a single mind suddenly found themselves alone in their own heads, and the psychological shock was devastating. Those ships faltered, their perfect coordination dissolving into confusion and panic. The Confederation forces pressed the advantage, concentrating fire on the disrupted vessels and destroying them before the Unification could adapt. But the Unification learned quickly, and their fleet began shifting tactics, adjusting to fight without the Gestalt network and relying instead on traditional command structures. The battle devolved into a brutal slugging match where neither side could gain decisive advantage. Hours passed, and the casualty counts climbed into numbers that would haunt survivors for generations. Sullivan monitored the battle from the command center, her role now reduced to watching as history unfolded in fire and death beside her. Chen stood rigid with stress, knowing that her own species was responsible for this slaughter. "It's not working," Demaro Crench said grimly, as another squadron was annihilated. "We're bleeding them, but they're bleeding us faster at this rate. We'll be destroyed within 6 hours." Chen stared at the tactical display and made a decision that she knew would define the rest of her life. "Give me a strike squadron," she said. "Mixed crew. Best pilots you have? I'll lead them directly at the Unification flagship." Crench looked at her as if she had gone insane. "That's suicide," he said flatly. "Their flagship has the heaviest defenses in the fleet." Chen smiled, and it was not a happy expression exactly. She said, "Which is why they won't expect anyone to be crazy enough to try it. And I know something about that ship that your tacticians don't. I know how humans think when they believe they're invincible." 20 minutes later, Chen sat in the pilot seat of a Confederation strike fighter with Sullivan in the co-pilot position and a squadron of volunteers from 6 species flying in tight formation around them. "This is insane," Sullivan said as they accelerated toward the heart of the Unification fleet. "We're going to die." Chen's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. "Probably," she agreed. "But if we can take out their command ship, the rest of the fleet will lose coordination. Sometimes you have to risk everything to save anything." They plunged into the maelstrom of battle, weaving through debris fields and weapon fire that would have vaporized them if their timing had been off by fractions of a second. The Unification flagship, the massive dreadnought Manifest Destiny, loomed ahead like a mountain of metal and menace. Shun opened a channel on human frequencies and began speaking in English, broadcasting directly to the Unification command crew. "This is Commander Rachel Chen of the Terran Republic Survey Corps," she announced. "I'm addressing the crew of Manifest Destiny. You're fighting in the name of humanity, but you've forgotten what humanity actually means. You've turned yourself into machines, into weapons, into exactly the kind of monsters that every other species fears on the bridge of Manifest Destiny." Fleet Commander Zhao heard her words, and his face twisted with contempt. "You dare lecture us about humanity?" he responded. "You who abandoned Earth when it needed unity most. We are the perfection of the human species, the culmination of 8 centuries of advancement. You are a relic from a weaker age." Chun's squadron broke through the defensive screen, and suddenly they were inside the flagship's firing envelope. "You're not perfection," Chen said as she armed her weapons. "You're what happens when humans forget why we went to the stars in the first place. You've sacrificed everything that made us human, just to become better killers." She transmitted data directly into the Unification network, footage of the atrocities committed on Earth, of the billions killed in the name of genetic purities. Some of the Unification crews saw it and hesitated, seeing for the first time the true cost of their ideology. Chen fired every weapon her fighter carried directly at the flagship's bridge. Shields held, but the psychological impact was devastating on 3 unification vessels. Mutinies broke out as crews who had seen the truth refused to continue fighting. Zhao, enraged by this betrayal, ordered those ships destroyed human. Weapons turned on human ships, and the unification fleet began tearing itself apart. Chun's squadron breached the flagship's hull, and she led a boarding action with Slaven and their mixed species teamed they. Fought through corridors filled with posthuman soldiers who moved with inhuman speed and precision, but Chen had something those soldiers lacked: the ability to think creatively, to improvise, to work as a team with beings completely different from herself in the flagship's command center. She came face to face with Zhao He was posthuman perfection, his body enhanced beyond normal limits, his reflexes faster than anything baseline humanity could achieve. The fight was brutal, and one-seated Zhao was stronger, faster, more efficient in every measurable way, but Chen wasn't fighting alone. Sullivan provided covering fire with her forearms, used his tentacles to create obstacles. Kyra's crystalline body refracted, targeting lasers together, working as a team. They did what no individual could have done. Chun stood over Zhao's broken body and broadcast to the entire unification fleet, "This is what humanity really is." She said, "Not genetic perfection or superior genes. It's the ability to find common ground with the alien. To build something together that none of us could build alone.